All right, here we are, Brock. It is Eclipse Day. For those of you who are watching us around the time that we're actually recording this, today was the day the eclipse kind of went through the United States. Neither Brock or I was in the path of totality, but it was a good day to be reminded of God's power, of His creative power, and His power over all of creation. And that power and that creative power is a part of what we think of when we think of the attributes of God. And so today, we're going to be talking some more about the attributes of God, the divine attributes, based on our reading of Volume 2 of Reformed Dogmatics by Herman Bavinck. We're in the chapter entitled The Names of God, in a section entitled Divine Simplicity, Essence, and Attributes. And after spending some time sort of introducing that and talking about some of the issues around the attributes of God and around divine simplicity, today we're going to dive into a section entitled Distinction of Attributes. And this is a very philosophical section, Brock. There's a lot of interesting stuff here, history, sort of diving into some of the ideas of different philosophers and thinking about how do we think about these attributes of God? And you know, we're not going to make a distinction between sort of essence and attributes. We you know, generally have this idea of the simplicity of God, and yet there's much more to it than that. How do we deal with the fact that we describe God in multiple ways, right? And we have these attributes that, at least to our minds, you know, seem like, well, here's one attribute, here's another attribute, here's another attribute. They build on each other, or there are different sort of factors to it. And yet we say all of those in some ways are God's very essence, his goodness, his justice, his love. And so Bavinck is spending some time dealing with some of those issues and looking at how some key theologians sort of dive into this issue, and philosophers as well, and important people, people like Augustine, people like Spinoza get talked about here, and as well as some other folks who perhaps are not quite as well known by those sort of outside sort of the real deep dive into this philosophical issue. But what I wanted to start with, Brock, is just to pick your brain a little bit as you read this particular section, and especially in sort of the follow-up to this initial part that we discussed last week, thinking about God's simplicity and some of the issues around that, and some of the questions that some people have about, you know, what is truly orthodox in this area, what sort of boundaries are there? Are they a little wider? Are they a little narrower? And how we think about those things. What did you think about this section? And more importantly, what do you think is the importance of this section? Why does Bavinck include this? And why should we be reading it, even though it can be a little bit of a slog to get through it? How's that for a softball to start right out? A softball going at about 100 miles an hour down the plate.
Chuck, you have wound up the pitch, and you have served me a beautiful softball, which is greatly appreciated for this topic. Chuck and I were talking about before we started recording, we were talking about the attributes and their relationship to each other is one of the quickest ways to get labeled a heretic in the theological space. As a matter of fact, you can count on saying something to offend somebody with almost certainty. So with that in mind, this section is vital from Professor Bavinck, and I would like for us to spend some time talking about it. Now, before we talk about the meat of this section, it's maybe helpful to consider the standard treatments. So what are people typically talking about when they talk about the attributes of God? And I am getting a graphic ready here. Let's see if we can see it now. Okay, that's a little small. Let me make it a little bit larger. Okay. Now, I apologize for the formatting on this document, but this document, this is a view into the doctrine of God from Pastor Greg Nichols, a Reformed Baptist pastor. And the idea behind this is not to get caught up in the weeds of reading the text, but just to see how classically Reformed people can talk about this multiplicity of attributes. And then we have to face the question of under what basis can we even talk about God's attributes in a consistent, coherent, sound way. And so let's just give an example here. We have 4 theologians, Hodge, Dabney, Boyce, and Smith, who talk about God's attributes under a certain heading or listing. So somebody says, well, what are God's attributes? And surprise, surprise, Chuck, you don't get a uniform listing across Reformed theologians. You don't get this list of 14 attributes that all Reformed theologians agree upon. You instead get different lists of similar things categorized in one way by one group of authors, in another way by another group of authors. And that's the whole point here of referencing this with Nichols. So these 4 authors, Hodge, Dabney, Boyce, Smith, they're giving us insight into this by talking about God's spiritual unity, his essential infinity, his omnipresence, his simplicity, his incommunicable attributes, like his incorporeality, his eternity, his omnipresence. And then finally, we get down to wisdom and knowledge, intellectual will, power. We get to justice, holiness, moral goodness, love, truth, faithfulness. And again, I apologize for the formatting. The thing that is important here is not the format of the list. It's that this list is not going to look exactly the same as the other lists. So, for example, in the next section here, Nichols outlines 4 other different Reformed theologians, including Herman Bavinck. So Bavinck, Dag, Pink, and Berkhoff, they give us a slightly different grouping. They again use the communicable, incommunicable distinction. They talk about independence, spirituality, decrees, self-existence, immutability, immensity, knowledge, infinity, eternity, oneness, goodness, power, patience, knowledge, wisdom, grace, ethical wrath, goodness, holiness, righteousness. Then there's a third group, Strong and Hodge, and we'll get a similar treatment, but not exactly the same. Absolute simplicity, sovereignty, spirituality, unity, will, life and personality, righteousness, blessedness, eternity, immutability, omnipotence, truth, omnipresence, Gill will have a different take, and then Charnock will as well. Shedd and Thornwell give us another take, and this list here is organized a little bit in a better format to look at. But we see some of the same principles, but not exactly always the same, or always in the same order, or always treated the same. So spirituality, self-existence, simplicity, thought, will, infinity, unity, simplicity, omnipresence, communication, eternity, immutability, knowledge and wisdom, independence, eternity, immensity, power, all-sufficiency, holiness, immutability, justice, goodness, benevolent mercy and grace and truth. And then Nichols says this in the highlighted portion: none of these arrangements is absolutely right or wrong. Scripture gives no inspired way to present God's attributes. And so the point of this, Chuck, to start off, is first of all to note that we are not dealing with absolute terms in absolute contexts that we can list in a single canonical way and all look at it and, give a golf clap. Oh, ooh, God is this. Ooh, 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 ooh. No, we're looking first of all at the results of a systematic investigation of the Scripture, and then we're looking at organizing and acknowledging these major categories according to how it's presented. And so people who want there to be one list, one official list of God's attributes, are going to be shocked, dismayed. I don't want to say their faith is going to be shaken, but people looking for that single answer, this is the canonical standard, are going to have to face a different picture. And that was the point of this here. Now, there are some really important reasons why this should be. So first of all, Chuck, if we were average Reformed theologians, what we would do is we would just talk about the attributes. I'd say, hey, Chuck, tell us about God's love. And you'd tell us about God's love. And then you'd say to me, Brock, tell us about God's justice. And then we'd talk about God's justice. And that's still worth doing. But we have to, I think, first of all, enjoy that Professor Bavinck has given us something more, which is an explanation behind the organization of the material. And then on top of that, we can see why creating that one single canonical list is so difficult. And then after we do this, we can appreciate the efforts that authors have made. And so we are going to get into Professor Bavinck's treatment. To prepare us to do that, I've given us a picture outlining why I think this is such a challenge. Well, Brock, why isn't there just one list of attributes? Come on, man. And then people want to start shaking the screen. Come on, you theologians, come up with that list. Well, let's take a look at what we're thinking about here. And this is a linguistic, this is a language-based approach. So I'm using language concepts here to refer to different ideas in different realms to try to give us some context. So where do we live and move and have our being? Well, we live in God's creation. Now, if you look at this image, it's a complicated image, but let's just make it easy and start with the right-hand side. There is a gray portion, and then there is everything to the left of the gray box. Now, in that gray portion is eternity. And in eternity, we talk about things, quote unquote, existing and being and having some substance to them. Now we're going to have to qualify what that means, but the point is there is an eternity separate from the created universe in which we live in. Now, Chuck, I'm going to tell my funny joke. I tell people that on occasion I will turn all the lights in my room off in the evening when it's dark. I'll turn all the lights off and we will be sitting there in the pitch black. And then I will say in the dramatic fashion as I can, let there be light. And Chuck, not once has light sprung into existence except and unless my hand was near the light switch and I pressed it. So what's my point? We have this, what's represented in this image, this gray box. And it is prior to, conceptually, the creation, what God has made when he spoke things into existence. So this would be things like God himself, concepts like being, which has a transcendence even over the created order. God's attributes, which is the subject of our discussion tonight. Who God is, the ways in which he's named. These are denominated in eternity. They're not specifically items of creation. The laws of logic, for example, precede the created order and are a part of this eternity that God inhabits. The same thing with the articles of the faith, the preambula fidei. These are the prolegomena. These are the things that you have to have in order to, let me start again. These are the things that you have to have conceptually in order to talk about the creation that God does. And then everything to the left of that gray box is a particular scene in God's created universe. I'm going to talk more about that created universe, Chuck, but I just want to throw it over to you to maybe just talk about and emphasize why we're taking such a long way to get into the topic of the attributes and why a diagram like this is hopefully going to be helpful.
Well, I'm hoping you're going to dive a little more into that since you created the document. But what I will say is this: first of all, it is important for us to understand, and we've talked about this before, the creation distinction, right? The creator is above all of creation because he's the one who created it. And so he is from eternity. And so there are these things that are greater than the world that we live in, this created world, because they are from eternity. And God and who he is certainly beyond that. And so one of the reasons that's so important is, I think, as humans, we have a tendency to forget about eternity, to forget about that creator-creation distinction, and to start trying to make assumptions based solely on the created world. And then by doing so, we limit God to that created world. And by limiting God to that created world, we're basically chopping him at the knees, chopping him at the arms. We're turning him into something that he absolutely isn't, and we also miss out on who he is when we do that. And so it's important for us to understand that, first of all. And then what you've done here, and I think I'm going to let you get into some of this as well, is even within the created order, there are we have to think sort of about how do we perceive things, how do we know things, what does our mind allow us to understand, and only by understanding that can we actually talk about some of these issues, because that has an actual impact. Our own thinking about thinking has an impact on the answers that we come to. And so I'm not, I don't want to steal any of your thunder here, because I think you're going to get into a lot of this, but it's interesting to me. You've got that short sentence, the tree is green, in these various different categories. And that's because depending on how within the created world, how do we think about that sentence, the tree is green? What is the meaning there? What is greenness? What is treeness? What does is mean? Those are all things that actually we have to dive into in order to get a full on understanding of what things are. And sometimes I think there's this tendency to say, oh, you philosophers, you're talking about angels dancing on the head of a pin, and what does is mean, and what is green, and what's greenness. But yet I mean, even in everyday life, we end up having to think about it, right? I was talking to a good friend of mine who's colorblind, and so his perception of color is not the same as most people, and for him, that makes that gives him some difficulties. One of them is driving. His brother is also colorblind, and so if he and his brother go somewhere, they don't have anybody to sort of check them and say, I don't know, wait, oh, the light's green, no, now the light's red. Fortunately, most traffic lights are created in a particular way in the United States, and you kind of can have an understanding based on the order of the lights and things like that. And there are some things that he can see, certain forms of gray to him, he understands to have some sort of meaning that he can't see, but he hears enough people talking about. But that gets into what is our visual perspective on green? What is our understanding of it? Is green merely a set of wavelengths? What do all of us see the same green? Does when the wavelengths hit my eyes as green, is it the same thing that Brock sees? Or if I were suddenly to be placed in Brock's brain, would I suddenly be like, whoa, what are you seeing every day? That's not what I see. We don't know that, and yet we have to have a way of talking about these things amongst each other. And so it's it's something that we have to deal with, and we have to understand. I have another question, but I'm going to think about it before I ask it. Maybe towards the end of, if it hasn't sort of coalesced by the end of our discussion here, I may ask that question, just as maybe something else is coming.
Yeah. And by the way, thank you, Chuck, for running with this. For our viewers, I literally just sprang this diagram on Chuck. Now, I had a similar diagram that we talked about together 2 or 3 years ago, and I resurrected some of the elements from that. But it's worth talking about, because if you buy into this image and what it's trying to present, then you will see why there is such confusion in discussing what it means for God to have attributes. And so let me continue now with this diagram. Everything to the right in that gray box is in eternity. And you will see that we have God, we have being itself, which transcends the being of existence in our particular universe, our created order. Then you have God's attributes, the laws of logic, the preambula fidei, we mentioned those. And in particular, in the black text, the black boxes, look at being and look at attributes. We are talking about, in eternity, what God is, separate and independent from our created order. Now, that's very difficult to conceive of and imagine unless one takes some special care. Now, to the left of the gray box, we have an image, a scene from God's created order, from his universe. Now, this scene is a beautiful green field, and we have our human observer. This young lady is in the green field, and she's a part of that scene, and she's observing the scene and thinking about it. And so there are three, I call them worlds, to the left of the gray. The largest world is that noumenal world, and that is the world as it truly is, according to this Kantian noumenal understanding. And so what does that mean? That means independent of observation. That means the thing in itself. And so you can see in this noumenal world, there is this field, and there is a tree in this field, and this tree has certain qualities that are independent of this young lady's observation. If the young lady goes away and ceases to observe, this tree still has those attributes. It still has that being. And now we see the first sentence, the tree is green. In the noumenal world, that statement, the tree is green, has a particular meaning. Other items that belong in this world, this noumenal world that exists in God's creation, but that we don't see directly or empirically, are things like Boolean statements about the world. For example, the atomic number of oxygen is 8, is an example of something that's noumenally true. It's something we observationally discovered, but it's a quality that's independent of our observing it. Also, I included in here abstract objects, such as the empty set, the set containing the letter A, and then the set of all sets. And then finally, I included things here, other abstract objects like numbers, the number 1, the number 2, the value pi, the square root of 2, irrational numbers, the square root of -1, complex numbers. These things are not observable. I cannot look at one, and neither can you. And yet, their existence and their substance somehow governs our reality that we live in. Also in here would be physical laws prior to their discovery. Now we go to the smaller image of the field that our woman is standing in the bottom, and that's called the phenomenal world. And in this phenomenal world, we have this word being in that green box. So being in that green box, by the way, did you notice in the noumenal world, we have being in a blue box. And then in eternity, we have being in a black box. Now, in this phenomenal world, we have our observer, the young lady. She's standing in the field. She sees the tree. And in this objective world in which she is a part of, one can predicate a sentence, the tree is green. Now that tree is going to be green even if the young lady is not present. Or perhaps she's present and Chuck, you wander into the field and you encounter the same tree. Or perhaps neither of you are there. The tree will still be green in some empirical and observable way. Now, finally, we get to the young lady herself. We get to her subjective world. This is her thought life. This is her conscious and her subconscious. This is her thinking, being a rational being, also having a faculty of memory, faculty of mind, faculty of reason, logic, and pathos, the things that make up being human. And in her mind, there is a sentence that she is considering and contemplating as she walks in this field. The tree is green. Now, Chuck, here's the important thread throughout this entire picture. The word being is in a white box in her mind. Then it's in a green box in her empirically perceived world. It's in a blue box in the noumenal world. And then finally, it's in a black box in the eternal conception. And the whole point is this. We've identified 4 different dimensions in which it's important to talk about being. Do unicorns exist? Do they have being? Well, not in eternity, at least as far as God has revealed to us. Also, not in the noumenal world or the phenomenal world. Yet in the subjective world of that lady, unicorns may have being. What's my point? If we fail to understand that discussions about being and essence have to wrestle with these 4 different dimensions, we're going to get things very confused. And so all of this is just to outline why these discussions are so difficult and why even philosophers are wrestling with each other over the best way to talk about them. So Chuck, we're going to get into Bavinck's text. We really are. But we had to first talk about this image to try to help us move through and address what Professor Bavinck's talking about in this section. So Chuck, let me throw it over to you for follow-on here. We've got a picture. We're talking about being in these multiple senses and manifold senses. How does this hopefully help people to think about the confusion that can happen in theology when we're not carefully considering them?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that as philosophers talk about these issues, many of them will give short shrift to one or more of these boxes. Empiricists, right? They're going to give short shrift to eternity because they can't touch it, they can't perceive it, so it must not exist. Those who really want to be just empirical may give short shrift to the subjective world and say the only thing that's real is that which we can perceive. The romantics may say, well, no, what's really important is that subjective, and the other things, they're there, and maybe not eternity again. But there is, I think, the various perspectives that people have will often give short shrift or put too much focus on one of these boxes compared to the others. And I think one of the things that we can do in thinking about these issues and reading other philosophers and theologians is to keep this picture in front of us and think about, okay, does this view of the world, does this view of what we're talking about here, does this take into account all of these different aspects of the world? Or is it putting too much focus on just, say, the subjective world, or is it eliminating any kind of understanding of eternity? And I think that's an important thing to do. I think I'm not going to ask. I'll just tell you what my question is. I don't think we need to spend any time with it because it's not related to our topic here today. It might be something we will talk about in the future. But is laws of logic? Is it, when God created the laws of logic, did he because he created them, are they actually a part of the world, the creation that he created, or are they from eternity? And I think sometimes there are some differences in certain Christian philosophers over issues like that, as to at what point do we take things like the laws of logic and place them as more eternal than, say, those things in the noumenal phenomenal world or in our subjective way of thinking. It's just a really interesting thing to think about, and we're not going to dive into it today, but it's again one of those things that if we're going to really dive into meaning, and if we're really going to dive into what that meaning means based on God being the creator, these are actually important topics. They're not everybody's cup of tea, perhaps. So there might be, I can think of a few of my friends who probably, if they were watching this episode, probably turned it off already. And that's okay, But if we're really going to dive into a lot of these concepts, I think we have to have this understanding and have this sort of prolegomena, as you've described it, this sort of making sure that we've sort of, before we get to where we're going, we understand that we've sort of created a framework for how we're going to talk about it. So that's really the usefulness of that picture. It's also kind of fun just to think about what is green. One of my college professors used to start philosophy class just by asking questions like that. So what is green? And then go around the room and ask these poor college sophomores, many of whom are taking philosophy because they have to, because it's a core course. Like, what is green? It's a color. Yeah, but how do what is it? Okay, what's green? Can you tell me about something's green? And just blowing people's minds. And I think this professor kind of enjoyed doing it. Some of my friends sort of enjoyed watching it happen. So, but it is important. It's more than just a sport to watch confused college students' brain explode.
Absolutely. And Chuck, you asked a question. What about the laws of logic? Are they part? Should they be nestled in the noumenal world instead of eternity? Well, that's going to be an open question, philosophically speaking. There are going to be people who argue that the laws of logic are universe dependent. However, as Christians, I think most Christian philosophers will locate the laws of logic outside of creation, because conceivably God could have created many other universes, even though he only created ours. And so in that sense, the laws of logic seem to actually undergird reality. We could imagine God having said those words, "Let there be light," and creating an entirely different universe under different governing principles that still had a harmonious, logical relationship, and yet we're completely different from the universe we know and understand. So that's why that's there. I think the interesting thing is going to come with abstract objects like the number 1, the number 2, pi, square root of 2, square root of -1. Are they part of the laws of logic and live in eternity? The same thing with the sets. And that's going to be a fun discussion. I prepared the slide at last minute and at great expense, as the joke goes. So I located them in the noumenal world for the time being. Now, the interesting thing is going to be, how then can we have any philosophy of God's attributes at all that doesn't face charges of being incoherent and contradictory? And I want to get into Professor Bavinck's text. Now, when we do that, let me first read Professor Bavinck's answer. Sometimes when you're investigating these things, you need to read the answer first and then see the candidates that fell flat or failed to make the cut. And why that should be. Now, Professor Bavinck says this: It was therefore correctly said that this diversity of attributes is rooted in God's revelation itself. For it is not we who call God by these names. We did not invent them. But it is God himself who reveals all his perfections and puts his names on our lips. It is he who gives himself these names and who, despite our opposition, maintains them. It is of little use to us to deny his righteousness, one of God's attributes. Every day he demonstrates this quality in history, and so it is with all his attributes. He brings them out despite us. That's important, Chuck, because when we look back at our picture here, an empiricist, like you said, is going to talk about being in the white box and being in the green box. But if that empiricist is positivistic, they're going to deny the blue being and the black being. The subjective idealist, for example, think of here of a Berkeley, might in fact only indicate the subjective world and being in this white sense, because it is being in the mind of the perceiving subject. That is the being that has the preeminence. And so you can see how relativism might spring forth if you talk about being in the white box and don't talk about being in the other boxes. Your idea of existence is going to be highly relativistic. If you include being in the green box in addition to the white box, then you can be very empirical. Now, as soon as you transcend that into being in the white box, in the green box, and now in the blue box, then you can come into being in a classical sense. And I mean classical in an agnostic sense, a classic reasoning, cross multiple religions, cross multiple different schemas of understanding. And then finally, when you consider all four modes of being, then I think you are starting to build out a Christian conception. Now, we can do this because God gives us a warrant from the scriptures. Now, there's a beautiful analogy that comes out of this that comes from Augustine. And if you look at the statement highlighted in blue at the top, you can see that Bavinck leads with something that's going to sound like Augustine is making God's attributes merely subjective. She says this: indeed, Augustine expressly states that these predicates or qualities, when attributed to God, are really the passions, the affections of our own spirit. Now here's the text. Whichever of these you affirm concerning God, not only is it wrong to suppose that one ascription refers to one thing and another to a different thing, but also that anything is affirmed worthily, because these ascriptions pertain to souls, which in a measure, here it comes, are filled with that light and affected by it in accordance with their own qualities, just as when this visible light begins to shine upon physical objects. If it is withdrawn, all these objects have the same color, or rather, they have no color. But once it has been brought out and illumined these objects, then although this light is of one kind, nevertheless, it suffuses the objects with a luster that varies in accordance with their different qualities. Now, is Augustine saying that the attributes of God are subjective? No. He's making the link between the worlds. Augustine is saying there is a link, let me go back to our picture, between the white being, between the green being, the blue being, and the black being. And when we use our language in our creaturely way, when we speak our baby talk, we still speak truthfully because it's baby talk God has been pleased to condescend, to reveal to us about himself. So God is love, Chuck. But when I say that with all of my creaturely associations, I'm still not confounding the objective nature of God as a God of love. Same thing for all of his other attributes. And so this is why we have to be careful. Look at this text in red. And let me read this from Professor Bavinck. Then, Chuck, I'm going to pull it over to you to build upon. But here's the thing. Professor Bavinck says in the red text, with this in view, he, Augustine, speaks of the simple multiplicity or the manifold simplicity present in God, and calls God's wisdom simply manifold and uniformly multiform. Now, Chuck, if you and I would have led this discussion session with this quote, okay, viewers, God's attributes, they are simple, they are a simple multiplicity. They're simply manifold and uniformly multiform. We would be saying in the same sentence, God's simplistic, undivided, immutable ways are the same as all of the distinguishing mutable ways that we can then speak of him. And people would say things like, that's incoherent, that's crazy, that's contradictory. How can you talk about such things? But the point is, we are relating them to this picture. The young lady is thinking transient, mutable, temporary thoughts. But she is genuinely thinking about objective, true, and eternal things when she reads the scriptures and God presents himself to her. And Chuck, that's the backbone of revealed theology. Let me ask you to follow up on that.
Yeah, and I think I would direct us there. Bavinck, just a little bit later, page 127 of the text, says something that I think that's really important. I'm going to read it because I think he says it better than I could. And he's talking about, this discussion and how it appears we're seeing things in different ways. But he says this diversity of attributes, moreover, does not clash with God's simplicity. This idea that we can talk about God's simplicity, that's not sort of, different than the fact that we can talk about these different attributes. They can go together. For that simplicity does not describe God as an abstract and general kind of being. On the contrary, it speaks of him as the absolute fullness of life. It is for this very reason that God reveals himself to finite creatures by many names. So this simple God, simple, in this philosophical sense, still is able to reveal himself to us using many different names, sort of a diversity of names, because it helps us to be able to understand who he is as the absolute fullness of life. The divine essence is so infinitely and profusely rich that no creature, no mere creature, nothing created by God can grasp it all at once. Just as a child cannot picture the worth of a coin of great value, but only gains some sense of it when it's counted out in a number of smaller coins, so we too cannot possibly form a picture of the infinite fullness of God's essence unless it is displayed to us now in one relationship, then in another, now from one angle, and then from another. And this is what your picture is doing here. It's presenting us a picture of this God, this eternal God, this God who in many ways is simple, it doesn't have these things that clash with each other in sort of his diversity, but it allows us to understand. God allows us to understand him by looking at it from these different angles, maybe from the angle of eternity, maybe from the angle of the phenomenal world or the noumenal world or the subjective world. These are different angles at which we can look at things. So like the word being there, right? We're understanding being from these different angles. Well, this is just a picture of what God has done for us. He's allowing us to understand him by sort of providing us these various different angles from which to perceive him. And Bavinck goes on and says, God remains eternally and immutably or unchangeably the same, but the relation in which he stands to his creatures and they to him varies. The light remains the same, even though it breaks up into different colors. And he talks about what Augustine said, and you mentioned that as well. He says, fire does not change, whether it warms us, illumines us, or consumes us. And there he's talking about something Moses Maimonides said. And grain remains grain, even though depending on the stage in which it comes to us, we call it seed or food or fruit. And there he's quoting from Basil. God is called by different names on account of the varying effects he produces in his creatures by his ever constant being. So these different names, this diversity of names that we use to understand him, to call on him, to picture who he is, those various names really are an account of the varying effects he produces in us by his ever constant being, by the fact that he is who he is and is immutable and does not change and is simple, but yet he can produce these various effects on us. And so that's how we understand him. And so that paragraph to me really helped to sort of tie some of this discussion together as to, well, why is this important, and how is it that we can sort of use different names of God and sort of understand these attributes that to our small minds almost seem like there's the potential for them to clash, and yet we understand that they don't, in God, that they don't, because God is one. He doesn't he doesn't sort of compete with himself. And yet, we use this language in our imperfect minds that makes it seem like that it could. It's these angles, these different ways of looking at things, these different boxes that help us to understand who this ever constant being of God is.
Amen, my friend. Amen. You have brought it all together in a beautiful way, and it really mirrors what Professor Bavinck is presenting to us. So I'm just going to read Professor Bavinck because I don't think I can say it better, although you really summarized it so well. In this connection, we must remember that God can act in so many different qualities and be called by so many different names because there is kinship between him and his creatures. If this kinship did not exist, all the names would be untrue. But now there is in his creatures an analogy to what is present in God himself. His names, the names do not merely denote God as the cause of thing, but furnish, however feebly and inadequately, some inkling of the divine essence. So when we refer to God by all these names, we speak imperfectly, in finite terms, in limited human ways. Here's the key, Chuck, yet not falsely. For though in God knowing and willing, righteousness and grace always constitute the one full being, yet in these many perfections, God displays before our eyes that one rich being, as it were, consecutively and in juxtaposition. Although it is always the same being that confronts us in these names, each name by itself gives us a succinct statement of what that being truly is in its infinite fullness. In God, holiness and mercy may be the same in essence, yet our understanding of these two attributes, formed from God's self-revelation, differs. There is no name capable of expressing God's being with full adequacy. Given that reality, many names serve to give us an impression of his all-transcending grandeur. Now, Chuck, this reminds me of a quote. I believe it was from C.S. Lewis. Please correct me if I'm wrong. A quote from C.S. Lewis that says, "I believe in God because, not only because I see him, but because by him I see all things." Now, this is referring to that light principle. The thing about light is that light reveals, it illumines us through our sense perception, through our organ of perception. Light enters, and knowledge about the reality we otherwise could not know comes into our small minds. And though our minds are small, and though our internal representations are imperfect, yet they are true. And so, the Holy Word, Chuck, the Holy Word is the thing that connects all of God's revelation. The parts of the universe that we cannot see, including the outside eternal situation. It is all connected in our minds when we read the scriptures. The Word of God connects the eternal with the noumenal, with the phenomenal, with the subjective. And we have a rock that links it all together. And by the use of these analogies, by the use of these words that have come to us, we know God for who he is. Chuck, how there would be no other way for us to have this deep and rich knowledge that Professor Bavinck thinks of. And so I'm struck. We have to be, Chuck, people of the book. There's a tendency in many modern academies to want to deconstruct Christianity and reconstruct it in a new Christianity 2.0, a more tolerant, loving, and inclusive Christianity, by removing the scriptures as the foundational content. And so you have ethicists who want to talk about reconstructing Christianity out of the Christian consciousness that's in society. So Chuck, you get together, I get together, we write a Christian manifesto, humanistically speaking, and we reconstitute Christianity in new ways. Well, Chuck, we may all individually be Christians, but our Christian consciousness is not going to give us the information from outside of our phenomenal world and our subjective world. We're going to be lacking what the noumenal world, how it governs us, how it exists, and we're going to be lacking an understanding of eternal things that are completely outside of our scope if we limit ourselves to a scientific Christian consciousness. And so I don't believe there can be a Christianity 2.0 on those terms. And I think Professor Bavinck would oppose such a thing as well. Let me throw it over to you for some final thoughts, and let's just try to wrap this complicated topic up.
Yeah, you know, there's one last thing that I just wanted to mention, and it's not directly tied to what we've been talking about, but I think it's something that practically can help us to understand why these issues are still so important and why we need to understand them. So Bavinck, as you read, talks about how we must remember that God can act in so many different qualities and be called by so many different names because there is kinship between him and his creatures. If this kinship did not exist, all the names would be untrue, but now there is in his creatures an analogy to what is present in God himself. So even though we're spending our time here, primarily, this is the volume in Bavinck, about God and about creation, right? And so in many ways, we were like, well, we'll study man later. But yet there's this connection here. Because even as we attempt to understand who God is, what are his attributes? What is his sort of unified being? Who is this God? The way we understand him is because of the kinship that he has given us, that he's created between us, his creatures, and him. And beyond that, there's a kinship in many ways that he gives to all of his creatures through creation, right? That we see that in some of the accounts in Genesis, and we understand that there is a relationship between God and all of his creation, right? Job talks about how God speaks and the seas move, and the Leviathan has its being, and all those kinds of things. There is a kinship there that God has created. But now there's also this special kinship that God has with us as human beings, that kinship that's been created by what Christ performed and what he accomplished on the cross by his death and his resurrection. And that is, we are able to be united with Christ, our brother. And because of that, because of Christ's work, that kinship has been brought back, a kinship that we almost lost because we tried to get away from it. We separated ourselves from God, and yet that kinship is restored through what Christ has done. And so even as we're sort of spending our time thinking about who is God and what are these big pictures about the attributes of God and what is his aseity and what are the incommunicable and communicable attributes, we realize that the only way we understand any of this, and the only way we even really have our being, is because of our kinship with God. And that kinship is solidified through the work of Christ on the cross. And we're just 8 days past Easter right now, and I think it's just an amazing thing to think about here. And I know it's not quite on point with what Bavinck says here, but yet I think we can draw that out because I suspect Bavinck was thinking those things even then too. When Bavinck writes about the importance of this kinship that God has with his creatures and including with us, the human beings, that he condescended to use words that we've used multiple times in the last number of weeks to have that kinship with us. That's the way that we understand him. And so all of this discussion we're having, it only happens because God has created us and because he has created that relationship, that kinship relationship between us. So all praise to God for all of that. And so I'm gonna close in prayer. And in closing in prayer, I'm going to use some words from a hymn that we often sing at Easter time. Maybe you sung it, and maybe those listening also sung it. It doesn't directly relate to this, and yet it talks about the kinship that we have with Christ because of one of those attributes, his love for us. How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that you should give your only Son to make a wretch your treasure. How great the pain of searing loss, the Father turned his face away, as wounds which marred the chosen one bring many sons to glory. Behold that man upon a cross, our sins upon his shoulders. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished. I will not boast in anything, no gifts, no power, no wisdom, but I will boast in Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection. Why should I gain from his reward? I cannot give an answer, but this I know with all my heart, his wounds have paid my ransom. Amen. All praise to the Son, Jesus Christ.